Babble. I will not carry that torch. All right, friends, enough nonsense. Speaking of words, we have good ones today. We are continuing the book of Romans as we make our way through chapter 8. Today we start in verse 24. Remember, just the tail end of yesterday, we made this transition to the idea of longing. You might remember there was that language of groaning while we wait, and we continue those themes today. Verse 24 is where we'll start. For in hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes in what is seen? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. I think a couple of things right off the bat here. It's interesting and important that Paul says we were saved, not we are saved. We were saved. For Paul, salvation is not simply about what happens to us in the future. It is always also looking back to that moment of Christ's resurrection and his victory on our behalf. So we think when we use the word salvation that we're talking about the moment we quote unquote go to heaven. That's not what Paul means when he uses the word saved. We were saved in hope, and hope that is seen is not hope. Now that's overstated to some extent, but the point that Paul makes is a clear one, I think, that there's no reason to hope for what already exists. If you already get good news, you no longer need to hope that the news is good. And this is the point that Paul says. Hope, by definition, lives at the edge of our experience of our current situation. It is always forward-looking and therefore always something that isn't quite realized yet.
And notice the tense that saved is put in here, Clint, just to emphasize your point. We were saved. It's important to emphasize that we are not in the process of salvation based upon the level or amount or quality of the hope that we have. We have this unfortunate reality, I think, in American Christianity where we do sometimes put too much emphasis upon what we feel about a thing, and we might be tempted to believe that hope can be measured and that you are a better Christian or your salvation is more sure if you can muster up more hope. And we sometimes even try to whip ourselves into a bit of a frenzy, and we try to feel things spiritually, and that's not what Paul has in mind here. The hope is a natural reaction within us. Maybe some emotion, but also in our will, in our reason, in the way that we live our life. We live as those who have hope because we were saved. The reality of what Christ has done is held in front of us, and that is the thing that causes us to move into hope. And that movement from a Reformed perspective has to go that direction. It doesn't go the other way. We don't start with manufactured hope and that leads us to salvation. Salvation becomes the bedrock and everything flows out of it. The hope naturally arises as those who were saved in Christ.
And it's important that hope is not a guarantee. Hope is just that. It is hope. It is a way to carry our endurance into the future. It is a way to hold on in moments that are difficult. As we've been talking, right? We groan in labor pains until now. The whole creation, we groan inwardly as we wait for redemption. But we wait in hope, and that's exactly where we end this part of the passage. If we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Now, this probably needs to say we should wait for it with patience, because I am a living example that we often don't wait with patience. But this is the opportunity that hope gives us. The word patience means to endure, to hold up, to have long suffering. It is the ability, patience is the ability to wait well. And as we hope for what is not yet obvious, we build in our spirit a sense of endurance, a sense of forward looking. We wait with patience. And I think, I'll speak for myself. I don't know if there are others who struggle with being impatient. It is one of my lifelong battles. And patience is not, for most of us, or at least many of us, very easy.
Yeah, I don't want to read into the text, Clint, but it doesn't say with joyous patience
Sure.
or with excited patience. I think you've got to read patience here with the word that we had yesterday, that groaning, even labor pains until now. There's a sense in which we are forced into patience because of the reality of how God has worked salvation in the world. And in some ways, I think that it's worth emphasizing a point that we did make yesterday, that Christians stand in this very strange place in the history of time. Because as we see Christ, who effected salvation for us, we stand in the present truth of the gift that he has given us. Yet, we look ahead to a time when that truth will be all-encompassing, when it has been brought to bear even in creation, as we were told yesterday. We have hope because we know what has been done, and therefore we know what it implies for the future. Paul's saying that the thing in the rear view mirror tells us what is going to be coming around the bend, but we are still those anticipating the bend. We are not on the other side of it yet. And so we live in the midst of this promise that has been fulfilled, but is not yet completely worked out. And as those who live on this side of it, our patience, I think, has got to involve all of those adjectives. It's got to be some excitement. It's also got to be some pain. It's got to be some groaning. It's got to be some of us struggling in the midst of what has not yet come to bear. And that is, in some ways, really the definition of the Christian life, is to be those who know what lies behind, but hoping for what is ahead.
Exactly, Michael. And then there is a transition out of those words. There is a transition here. And I want you to notice this, friends, because Paul has not had to make this transition. In other words, Paul knows where his words are going to take us. And so rather than have to lead us to this, he can jump right into this next theme. Let me read it, and then I'll tell you what I mean. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we did not know how to pray as we ought. But that very Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. Now, I want you to notice we didn't say anything about weakness. At nowhere did Paul have to tell us we're weak. Why? Because when he's talking to us about waiting and groaning under the weight of our life and striving, seeking to have patience, it brings us to the point of acknowledging that we're weak. We hope for what we do not see and wait for it with patience. And we say, that is so hard. And Paul says, yes. And without having to explain it, knowing that he's gotten us there, he says, that's why the Spirit helps us in our weakness. Because what happens when we need patience? We feel weak and we pray. And so he says we do not pray as we ought. But the very Spirit, with sighs too deep for words, intercedes, helps us in our weakness. That the Spirit joins us in our waiting. The Spirit meets us in that place where we struggle with hope. And as we groaned, as creation groaned, now the Spirit groans with sighs too deep for words. And if you have ever been in a place where when you reached for prayer, beyond words and phrases and things that you could say, you simply felt the weight of those moments, then you understand this verse in a very real way. Those moments of prayer are sacred, but they are monumentally difficult. And Paul wants us to be reassured that when we are in them, we are not in them alone.
Yeah, I can only illustrate that point. I was in undergraduate school and I was interning at a Presbyterian church in downtown Tulsa. And I was interning with the youth program there, so I didn't really have any pastoral care responsibilities writ large. But I was the only one in the building besides the administrator, and someone came to the front door and said that they needed to talk to a pastor. And I wasn't a pastor, but I was there, so I went down to have a conversation with this person. And I was in my very early 20s, had no formal ministry training of any kind, but had a heart to try to serve if I could. And this individual laid out to me significant mental health issues, fears, anxieties. And I remember standing on the steps of the church while we came to the end of this encounter, and the person asked, "Would you pray for me?" And there's a moment in which you come to try to offer words on behalf of another person, and there are not simply words to draw from. What do you have to say that's not a platitude, or that isn't just some sort of scriptural saying, which those are good. And sometimes we turn to the Psalms and those are the only words we can find. I think if you've ever been in an encounter where there are simply not words that you have to draw from, you know that it's the very intercession of the Spirit that you rely upon. Essentially, God, may your words be the word in this encounter for this person, because I'm not going to have any human words that are going to be able to meet the needs that only you can meet. I think this is a beautiful example of how quickly Paul can go from talking about hope and talk about how there's difficulty in patience to now speaking to this very real and human and experiential part of what it means to be people of the faith. There are simply times that we come to pray and we do not know how to pray. And we give thanks to God who intercedes on our behalf.
I'm struggling to come up with the entire quote, but there is a poet. It may be Emily Dickinson. I don't hold me to that. There's a poet who said something very close to what you've described, Michael, and the words were something along the lines of, what can you say that will not offend the hearer with its shallowness? There are those moments where you think, I have words, and words are just not enough. There are no words that speak to this moment. And again, this is the promise of Paul. The Spirit intercedes for us in those moments where words are not needed, nor are they adequate, that there's something underneath the words, and that's the promise of God's intervention on our behalf. And then we finish this part of the section, and God, who searches the heart, knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. So again, notice how masterfully we started with our weakness. We have hope, we have patience. That brings to mind our weakness. And what do we think the antidote for weakness is? To get stronger. But Paul says, no, the antidote for weakness is to know that God intercedes for the saints according to his will. Faith is the antidote to weakness, not strength, but faith. Faith that helps us wait, faith that helps us hope, faith that helps us trust. And these are the things ultimately that move us through such moments in life, not our own strength. We don't simply become, somehow endowed with enough strength to meet all those challenges head on. No, we very slowly and very methodically are carried through those moments as God puts us and our lives back together in some instances. And this is incredibly well written. I love these verses. They are like much of what Paul writes. They are short and simple until you listen to them, and then you realize that there are miles deep.
It has something real to say about who we are as people, but I think it also has something to teach us about prayer itself. And let us not make the mistake of thinking of prayer as us getting God to decide that our way is the best way. So sometimes we're tempted to think of prayer as that mechanism of petitioning God to do things the way that we think that they need to be done. And God, by God's grace, is willing to receive our prayers, to be in communion with us, to reunite us in the triune life. But what Paul has to say here is God searches the heart. God knows our thoughts and intent. In many ways, God knows the prayer before our heart offers it. Prayer is more than just what we seek to see happen in our lives or in the lives of those that we love or in the world around us. Our prayer is, in a very deep way, connecting us with the power of God by the Spirit of God. In other words, we've had all of this discourse this week talking about the death. You remember that the death and the life, the flesh which holds us back, and the Spirit which calls us forward. Here, prayer is connected to the agency of the Spirit. So the idea is we're actually participating in our future life in God if we are participating in prayer, that we're participating in new life and setting aside the ways of the flesh, because God knows the thoughts and intents of the heart, because the Spirit is interceding for us, and God knows the mind of that Spirit who is in us. And so it starts with God, and ultimately it ends with God. And to whatever extent we are able to add our prayers to the intercessions of the Spirit, we are getting to participate in that life eternal, which is now a present reality open to the Christian by God's grace. And that's this beautiful sort of window I think we get to see into what prayer itself is. It's not just asking God for stuff or for a desired outcome. It's actually participating in a gift that God has given us and recognizing, being reminded of the very down payment of that gift, the Spirit within us.
And there are moments when the effect of prayer is not to change our life situation, but is to empower us to face it. It is, we think of prayer as maybe making a difference, but often the difference it makes is internal, not external. And as we wait, we are then renewed with our ability to be patient, to be hopeful. Some of what prayer does, it does not in the things we hope it ultimately will accomplish. It does in us when our situations maybe aren't changed in ways that we wish that they were. Some really good stuff.
Yeah, and we hope that you know the Spirit who intercedes, and that the very God who promises to be with us will go with you as you go into whatever this weekend holds. We look forward to being with you on Monday and continuing on as we hear Paul's word speaking to us.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you for joining us for this daily Bible study. If this is your first time, welcome. We are so glad that you have joined us for this time of intentional study of God's Word. You will find in the description of this video a link to our website. We would love to get to know who you are. We'd love to reach out and greet you personally, but be sure, whether or not this is your first time, to like this video. If you're on Facebook, share it so that other people might be able to find it too. If you're on YouTube, consider subscribing. You'll receive more content like this every day at 2 o'clock Central Standard Time. On top of that, every Wednesday at 9 o'clock, we release a Pastor Talk podcast, which goes through different series, but all of them about faith and life and discipleship of Jesus Christ. Friends, regardless of how many times you've been with us, we hope that this day has been meaningful for you as you seek to follow Jesus Christ. So until next time, be blessed. We look forward to seeing you soon.